Welcome to the EnviroNomics podcast video blog. I never did figure out the name. Like, is it video blog or vlog, or is there a... Okay, all right. What, yeah, to what? Both?
Yeah, to both.
Okay, call it whatever we want. So we'll call it a video blog podcast. We're here with Jim Lively. Jim is the community
Program director
for Groundworks. So Jim, why don't you tell us a little bit about what Groundworks does, and then we'd like to learn a little bit about your background as well.
Sure, thanks, Russell. So Groundwork, we're actually the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities. We've been in Northwest Michigan in the Traverse City area for going on 25 years now. We're moving into our 25th year.
And it was called something prior to that, right? You had a name change about 6 years ago?
Yeah, around at our 20th birthday, we had been called the Michigan Land Use Institute.
Okay.
And a lot of folks know us, maybe still that way, but
Right.
we went through a pretty significant name change to kind of allow us to talk that we do more than just what most people think of as land use.
Right.
We work on issues of food and farming. We work on issues of transportation. We've been working on bringing passenger rail back to Traverse City, done a lot of work with the transit agencies and bikeability and walkability. And then our other program area is what we call clean energy. And we've been working there for almost 10 years to really advocate for renewables, energy efficiency, and occasionally we would work against what we would consider to be polluting energy. So we've opposed coal plants in the past, and we've recently gotten involved in this Line 5 pipeline issue.
Uh-huh. So what's your background? Tell us a little bit about your...
All right. Well, I've been in northern Michigan since about 1990. I grew up in southeast Michigan, went to school at Michigan State, and got my first job here in Traverse City working at the Regional Planning Agency. It was then the Northwest Michigan Council of Governments. Now it's Michigan Networks Northwest.
Yeah.
Worked there for about 10 years, and then I've basically been at Groundwork, MLUI, for the last 18 years.
Okay. Wow, that's quite a while.
It's been quite a while.
Yeah. And you guys are located right downtown here.
We are right next to the Whiting Hotel near Cherry Republic on Front Street.
Yeah, I've been up there. So the reason we have you here is that we're going to talk about Line 5.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us, kind of brief history, how you guys started that as a topic.
Sure.
Something that you guys were concerned about, kind of go over that.
Well, yeah, so I was the guy that kind of helped within our organization elevate that issue. And it was one that I'd not heard of. I had no idea. I'm a lifelong Michigander, had no idea there was an oil pipeline in the Straits of Mackinac. And when I first heard it, which was 2012, I read this report. I kind of dismissed it like that can't be.
Right.
If there was really an operating oil pipeline, I probably would have known about that.
Yeah.
But upon reading it, I'm like, no, apparently that's really there, and people just have forgotten about it, literally.
So the finding out about this pipeline, it's about the same time that they had a big spill down in Marshall, Michigan.
That's it. So a partner group of ours now, National Wildlife Federation, one of their staff people was involved, grew up in Marshall. She lived in Marshall and had experienced the oil spill there.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, did a little looking into where else do these major oil pipelines.
And that's how
she found it.
Yeah. So she was like, wait a minute.
And then, but that her report, which was an excellent report called Sunken Hazard, done in 2012, wasn't getting any traction.
Uh-huh.
It basically came out, people kind of looked at it, and it went away. And I remember with a small group of other folks here in Traverse City, we were like, that seems, I guess what was going on nationally at the same time was the Keystone XL pipeline was a big deal.
Yep.
And, there were some of these folks were at climate rallies were saying, we need to work on Keystone. And I'm thinking, we have an oil pipeline issue here in Michigan that maybe people need to know about. So it was based on that we said, let's just at least let people know that this pipeline's there. And I'll bet if people understand about it and learn about it, that there's going to be a lot of concern and probably some action to make sure that we're not risking the Great Lakes from an oil spill like we had in the Kalamazoo River.
Did you guys get involved in the incident down at Marshall at all?
Not really.
Yeah.
No. We're more of a northern Michigan organization, so we knew about that and found that to be really troubling. And when we learned it was the same oil company with an older pipeline that was now in the Straits of Mackinac, or that we learned, that's when we said, this is an issue that people need to know about. So our first approach was just to raise awareness. Let's just tell people this risk is here. We did a rally at the Straits in 2013, got about 300 people to drive up there on a Saturday afternoon, and got a little media attention. And, frankly, got the attention of a couple folks that were concerned and said, we'd like to get you to fund you to the point of helping to make this a bigger issue.
Okay.
We think more people need to know about it.
Yeah.
And so from there, we created a website and brought in environmental groups. As we looked at the issue, we're like, well, who best to help elevate the issue than to talk to the people at Flow for Love of Water. We went to the Michigan Environmental Council. We went to Sierra Club, Michigan Citizens for Water Conservation. That's the group that had been working on the Nestle issue. Many of the Clean Water Action in Michigan. And these groups came together and formed this campaign called the Oil and Water Don't Mix campaign, which has still been the leading environmental group campaign that's kind of responsible for all those shutdown Line 5 pipeline signs that you're seeing around town. That's the group. It's really a coalition. It's not one organization. It's a coalition of about 30 or so environmental groups. We got that started in 2013, brought them together and gave them a space to kind of start working on it, and created the website. And groups like Flow did a lot of the important legal research that said, you know what, Michigan doesn't have the authority to shut down that pipeline. Michigan granted the authority to allow the pipeline in the open waters of the Great Lakes, and Michigan can revoke that easement. If it's not working for Michigan, our governor and attorney general have the authority to take away the easement, and that effectively would shut down the pipeline. So understanding that was really important news that took Governor Snyder a little while to figure out, but he and Attorney General Bill Schuette acknowledged this is our issue. We need to make sure we're protecting the Great Lakes.
Right. And it was about that same time that the incident in Marshall happened, that there was a big spill in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yes.
Which gave a lot of people like the visuals, like here's what oil looks like on a big body of water.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The Kalamazoo River spill was the largest, what's called inland water spill. It was in water, but they call that an inland, and it was, I think, a couple weeks before the BP Gulf Horizon.
Right.
And so Kalamazoo River didn't really get that much national attention because this other thing's gushing oil every day in the Gulf.
Yeah.
So it kind of got swept away.
Yeah. And I work in the environmental industry, and I'd watch the news, and it was on, the Gulf of Mexico thing was on the news every night for months. Yeah. So you're right, it did kind of get overshadowed. But I think from a public relations standpoint of what you guys are, advocating now, that kind of all the visuals of all the oil on the water kind of created that, like, this is what could happen here. Yeah.
Right. And, the difference that I think people kind of forget, they think of the similarities between BP, but nobody is actually drinking ocean water.
Right.
This is the drinking water for most of northern Michigan. The cities of Mackinac Island, Sheboygan, Charlevoix, like
Traverse
these folks
City.
are drinking that water. Traverse City.
Yeah.
So we have a different level of concern here. This would really be devastating for. Besides thinking of our beaches and our wildlife that would be damaged.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what specifically is, what's the current status of the line right now? What is it?
Well, boy,
I've heard that
that's
they
a big question.
Shut it off for a little while and then it's back on, and
well, no, the pipeline has continued.
But didn't Wayne Schmidt issue something? Remember when an anchor hit it or something like that?
So that last April, that it did. The biggest concern that the independent consulting firm that was hired by the state of Michigan to look at the risk, they said the number one concern was that it could get struck by a ship's anchor, and of course it happened just a couple months later.
Right.
Fortunately, it only dented the pipeline. It didn't rip it in two like some of the anchors out there on large freighters would completely rip that thing in half.
Right.
And there's 1 million gallons of oil in those pipelines at any given time. So if that thing gets ripped in half, we're looking at 1 million gallon oil spill, which is very significant. It is continuing to operate. We had quite a what happened in the last 6 months, Russell, or the last 4 years. Governor Snyder and Bill Schuette, the former Attorney General, were looking at the issue and trying to decide what course of action to take. And they had appointed a pipeline safety advisory board of some experts that did these studies. And then near the end, Snyder kind of went behind the scenes and started negotiating a deal with Enbridge that resulted in a deal that would be to have Enbridge build pay for and construct a tunnel under the Straits of Mackinac, about 100 feet below the bottom of the straits, and then they would be putting their pipeline in that tunnel. And this kind of wasn't fully vetted by this advisory board, but it was a deal between the governor and Enbridge behind the scenes. And then there was a hurry-up process before the legislature, the lame duck legislature, left at the end of December to get the necessary approvals for how to do that. And for a little while, the idea was, well, we're going to just give that authority to the Mackinac Bridge Authority, which is already there. And the Mackinac Bridge Authority basically said, no way do we want to be connected with having to also take care of a private oil pipeline and a tunnel for them. So they had to the legislature quickly amended the law, probably too quickly. There's a lot of legal challenges or concerns about the way they did it. But they did, literally in the last week of the year, tried to cement a deal that says Enbridge can put the pipeline in a tunnel. Now, there's some real problems with that idea, and that's really what I was hoping we'd be able to talk about.
Yeah, well, yeah, I just want to get our audience. Not everyone's going to understand all the, everyone's seen the occasional headline in the news. Obviously, me being in the industry, I followed a little bit, probably closer than most people.
Mm-hmm.
You clearly are,
I've been following it for 6 years.
Yeah, it's probably a big part of what you do every day. But so I'm just trying to establish the background so that people listening can understand that. And then tell us about the flaws that you see and how it was passed and what the weaknesses are.
So the idea of putting the pipeline in a tunnel would obviously make it safer. Right. I mean, right now there's two pipelines. They split it in half, and they're sitting literally in the open waters. They're being
we've all seen
hit by an anchor. You've seen the pictures.
The video even of like a diver swimming along them.
Yeah, I mean it's scary to think about all that oil right in the middle of the Great Lakes. The biggest concern about this tunnel deal is that it's not a tunnel yet. It's not going to be a tunnel for at least 10 years. So
really?
The concerns that we have about those current pipelines do not go away. They are planning to continue operating just as they are until that pipeline is at least 75 years old. And that's the biggest concern is, really if we're concerned about this, we should probably not be operating those pipelines like they are until the tunnel's built. But that's not the deal that the governor struck. Of course, Enbridge was helping to create the deal. It would keep those pipelines operating as they are. That risk doesn't go away until the tunnel's built. So that's the primary concern. Shut the pipelines down and then discuss whether or not a tunnel is a good option.
Right.
That's our concern. But we have some other issues about the pipeline itself and whether or not it's in Michigan's best interest. And that's the broader look at the oil industry and the pipeline infrastructure in North America. What's happened, and a lot of this happened since the spill in the Kalamazoo River in Marshall. Enbridge has been expanding their pipeline network massively to move what is Western Canadian tar sands oil. It's coming from Alberta, Canada, and they're trying to get it to the coast of North America, any coast. Trying to get it. The Keystone Pipeline was trying to get that oil to the Gulf Coast. There's efforts in British Columbia to try to move the oil to the west, to get it to a port where they can export it overseas, and they're also trying to get it to their east coast, which would be, to Montreal, Quebec. And the only way they can move that oil to the east coast right now is through Michigan. We have the two pipelines that Enbridge operates, both go through Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Line 6 is the one that ruptured in the Kalamazoo River, and Line 5 is the one that goes through the Straits. They've been expanding those pipelines in place, especially Line 6B, the one that ruptured in the Kalamazoo. After that rupture, they said, as appropriately, we will repair and replace this pipeline. But they more than doubled the capacity. And in fact, it has more room now. It could take all of the oil that comes through Line 5, that oil, in addition to what that was currently bringing through Line 6B. So they've essentially could have replaced Line 5 at the same time they replaced Line 6B and said, hey, we'll just shut down Line 5 and all the oil Michigan needs would come through the other pipeline. Now, they didn't want to do that. They're trying to bring more oil through Michigan, but it's not to Michigan. The thing that we've learned is that Line 5 is now a shortcut for Canadian oil to move through Michigan, and it's all going to Montreal and Quebec. It's getting to the East Coast, and we have become the shortcut. Line 5 oil is not destined for Michigan. It's destined for Canada. So when Michigan talks about building a tunnel, we're building a tunnel for Canada. And it's not our oil. We're not using it. We're using the oil that Enbridge brings us from their other pipeline.
Enbridge states that a good portion of I don't know
Yeah.
what percentage it is, but a lot of the propane that is used in the Upper
Right.
Peninsula comes out of that pipeline.
They sure do, and they love that. And I'll tell you what, they love to talk about the percentage of the propane that is used in the UP, because if they talked about raw numbers, it would be laughable. It is not a propane pipeline. It is an oil pipeline. Less than 0.5% actually brings propane to the UP. So they're not making any money off the UP. It's kind of an ancillary product that now has been working to their benefit. Yes, there's many folks in the UP that do rely on propane, but it's not really a lot of people. The number of people that live in the UP is, it's about 500,000.
Yeah.
And about half of them use propane. So we're talking about couple 100,000 people. We could easily bring propane to those folks by other means. It's not as if we need to be dependent on Line 5. That we are dependent on it, we could quickly shift to trucks or rail. There's a rail line that goes right through, 2 rail lines that go right through the UP. So that's been really troubling to hear, like, oh my gosh, we can't shut down the oil because of all this propane. It's literally a drop in the bucket. And they're using it as kind of a smokescreen to keep the issue going.
Right. Is there a benefit to Michigan to have this pipeline? I mean, is it all just negative? Is there some
No,
positives for the
There's
pipeline?
property tax for sure. That's
Right.
probably the number one thing that you'll hear is from some communities that say, "Hey, we're getting property taxes come into our community for this oil pipeline," and that's real. We have to acknowledge that. There aren't really many jobs. An operating pipeline doesn't need many people to keep it going. There's a few operating engineers that
Yeah.
check the valves,
Right.
make sure things are working. But it's property tax, which again is real, but I don't think it's, you have to put that next to the risk of what we're counting on with the Great Lakes.
Right.
Do we jeopardize our livelihood, our overall economy, which is based on the Great Lakes? So that's about it in terms of benefit. We don't get paid a dime by Enbridge for the use of the easement. They use it for free. They've been using it for 65 years. I'm sure they've paid it off about 45 or more years ago, and it has just been a free asset for them.
Yeah. I've heard you said that the alternatives would be either to truck it in or, use trains, rail cars. But I've heard that it's actually, they cause more spills, and that's actually a bigger hazard than a pipeline. What's your
Okay, well, that's good. So when I talked about trucking and rail, I was talking about propane.
Okay.
Certainly not the oil, because remember, that oil isn't coming to Michigan. If Enbridge wants to move their Canadian oil from the western part of Canada to the eastern part of Canada, they should really build a pipeline in Canada. And I think this is maybe the most important point for people in Michigan to understand. Canada has not allowed them to build a pipeline in Canada, north of the Great Lakes, because they're concerned about the risk to their water resources. Now, it's a little ironic, that our governor is proposing to build them a tunnel to put their oil through our Great Lakes and our most important water resource for them, because they aren't willing to build that pipeline in their own country. If they want to move their oil, they need a pipeline, and they should do it in their own country. The trucks and rail cars would be for the small amounts of propane that are coming along as this tiny free ride on the Line 5 pipeline. That wouldn't be very many trucks. It'd be very few rail cars. You know, we move an awful lot of propane all by truck. Every single household gets their propane by truck today. So it's not as if we're proposing something radical. Propane moves by truck and rail already. So it's important to remember this is an oil pipeline, and the oil in that pipeline is not our oil. It's going from Canada back to Canada. We're offering them a shortcut deal.
Let's talk about the tunnel. So you raise a concern that the existing pipeline is clearly, a potential hazard, and should it have a catastrophic leak, we could all agree that would be horrible. Right. What about the pipeline? If that tunnel were in, or that pipeline were in the tunnel now, we'll talk about that. I mean, is there some technical issues with that? Still some safety issues that you see?
Haven't really gone into that. I guess I'll just concede. I think an oil pipeline in a tunnel is going to be safer than an oil pipeline sitting in the open waters. Not going to argue that. But I think if we have to wait 10 years of risk for that, I don't think it's really a good. I don't call that a solution. I call that 10 years of risk.
So, I think everyone would agree that the level of risk doesn't go down until that pipeline is gone. What about who's paying for that tunnel? Is it a taxpayer subsidized corporate free ride or what?
So the governor was careful to try to make it become a public utility tunnel, because frankly, for Michigan to grant all of the permissions to a private company and to give it the authority, that's not appropriate. I mean, this is a private company. If they need a pipeline, they should build their pipeline and pay for it.
Yeah.
The legislature, this lame duck work was really designed to try to call it a public utility tunnel for the interest of Michigan, which they want to do by adding electrical lines in that pipeline. Because we also have electric cables. In fact, you probably remember one of those cables was snapped by the anchor.
The Mackinac Island in the middle of July or something. Yeah.
Well, the anchor that bumped into or that banged off the pipeline also ruptured or ripped one of the oil or the electrical cables in half. So we do have cables on the bottom. Those don't need to be 100 feet underground encased in cement.
Right.
They just need to be a little bit safer. So I consider that also, like, we're trying to find a solution to justify moving Canadian oil through this tunnel. I don't see it as Michigan's problem to help them move their oil. I think they need to move their oil their own way, find their own pipeline.
Yeah.
There is one other thing I do want to say about this, which I think also is in Michigan's interest. And when we talk about leaders making decisions for the future, I think I hope most folks that are listening to this podcast understand that climate change is real, and that we need to make decisions today about the future that doesn't have oil pipelines. And the deal that just got cut would allow Enbridge to operate that pipeline for 99 years. Well, we just heard a few months ago from the International Panel on Climate Change that we have about 12 years to start moving off of fossil fuels aggressively. So cutting deals for 100 years to allow Canada to go through the Great Lakes is just no longer acceptable, and we need our leaders to at least acknowledge that.
Yeah. So I'm just still unclear about the finances on the tunnel. Like, so the state's paying for it, or is Enbridge paying for it?
Enbridge would pay for it.
Okay.
That's the deal. They're saying Enbridge has to do it now. So.
But the state's granting the right of way, and it's really, under the guise.
The authority.
From your perspective, they're really doing it for Enbridge.
Correct.
And then kind of going, and we'll let some other people in there too.
Exactly.
That's your position.
That is almost I think.
Yeah. Because a electric cable doesn't need to be 100 feet beneath.
No.
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 Yeah.
And there's plenty of speculation, the way the deal was structured, that if Enbridge can continue operating the pipeline as it is, their current pipelines, for at least 10 years, they may never build this tunnel. I mean, the tunnel's going to be expensive and difficult, and they may just decide, you know what, if we can squeeze 10 more years out of this pipeline, maybe, 12 years because there's some legal challenges, it's still all just 12 years of profitable operating, while we take the risk. They may never build the pipeline or the tunnel.
Going back, talking about risk, the cost of a spill, I mean, clearly Enbridge, lost their ass in Marshall, Michigan.
Yeah.
From what I heard, last I heard, they were like $1.5 billion in expenses.
Right.
For a little bit of a pipeline, I don't know what the tunnel would cost to repair.
Oh,
To build, I mean.
To build, they're saying $500 million,
$500 million,
but it's almost certainly going to be more.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they've got their actuarial people working on what the risks would be and all that stuff, and I just can't imagine that, the profits on 10 years worth of oil is going to be worth one spill. I don't know.
Yeah.
I haven't done the numbers there, but maybe. I don't know what Enbridge does a year in revenue and profits.
I don't know their overall numbers.
Yeah.
I know it's massive.
Yeah.
They can afford this tunnel if they do decide they want to build it.
Right.
But I think they can also look at, that's where we need to, as a state, look at where we are in the global picture.
Yeah.
Because we're not. This isn't our oil. We need to keep that in mind, and then decide whether or not this is something that is in Michigan's best interest.
So the government shutdown that's going on right now, and I've seen some articles and things on Facebook and stuff about how the government's response to a spill in the straits right now is not quite adequate because of the shutdown.
So the one thing, this deal about waiting 10 years until the tunnel comes in, there were some concessions that will try to monitor the pipeline even more carefully. And one of the things they're doing is monitoring wave heights, because the understanding is if there's a spill, we need to try to get out and get some ships out there to try to contain some of the oil, which is honestly a little bit of a joke. But you can't get out if the waves are too high. So there's been talk, if waves get above 8 feet, 6 feet, we should shut down the pipeline because we couldn't contain a spill. Well, the monitoring stations for monitoring wave heights are I think it's the Army Corps of Engineers. They're not operating those buoys right now.
Okay.
So we really don't know what the wave heights are.
Oh, okay.
So that whole agreement that says we're going to make sure that we're being safe and that we could contain a spill, well, that just goes out the window if we're not monitoring the buoys in the straits. So that's, there's a lot of parts to how we're trying to piece this together. And mostly, Enbridge has not been the most forthcoming with trying to be responsible about how they're operating this pipeline. They've argued when there were wave heights, at 8 feet and beyond, that, well, we're not sure, we don't want to shut it down. Rather than being extra cautious, they've been essentially non-responsive when the state has tried to ask them to take extra measures to be precautionary. And that's given the fact that they already spilled in our, that 1 million gallons in the Kalamazoo River. It is a little frustrating to see the way they have been really not very responsible about the way they talk about the Great Lakes.
Well, is there anything else you can think you want to add on the pipeline issue?
I guess to carry through to where we are. So we talked a lot about what happened at the end of the year, and that was, in what's called the lame duck legislature.
Yeah, I not just in general, lame duck legislation always tends to be a little sketchy.
It tends to be a little sketchy.
Whatever party's in.
You got it.
Yeah, right.
And this was part of it.
Yeah.
They tried to hurry up a pretty complicated deal, and a lot of it really had been done. It was done behind the scenes, and nobody reviewed. These legislators that passed this bill authorizing this tunnel deal had not seen the deal because nobody had seen it. They just passed it.
Yeah, and I usually pay attention to stuff and like that, and you're right. I never saw it all.
Yeah, there was nothing to see. It didn't come out. So what's happening today is we have a new governor and a new attorney general, and they did pledge while they were running for office that they would manage this situation differently, treat Enbridge differently. And so they're right now looking at the constitutionality of the deal that actually got approved. Mm-hmm. And there were some real, legal challenge or legal questions about how that all got put together.
Yeah.
So that's being looked at right now by the Attorney General, and there's a better than even chance, I think, that some of that stuff won't stand up, that it was done inappropriately, too quickly. There were some real problems just with the way it was constructed.
Sure.
The other thing that we're hoping that the governor and AG will do is take a look at that issue of, well, while we wait for this tunnel, we can't accept this risk. They still have the opportunity to revoke the easement and say that current pipeline can't keep operating. You've been violating your easement and you're risking our lakes inappropriately. So that's what we hope will happen.
Yeah.
I know they're looking at it. And, with a new governor and a new attorney general comes a new opportunity to look differently at the issue.
Right. So what do you think the odds of them just having to shut it down until they build the tunnel? And do you think if they did shut it down now that they would just abandon the tunnel, just decide not to do it?
If they had to, you think it through. If they had to shut that down, they aren't getting their revenue. So if they're losing money every day, it's not operating, which probably makes it harder for them to justify. Or they either have to move really
So
quickly.
they're going to accelerate the tunnel or
Yeah.
abandon it altogether?
And I don't think accelerating it is going to be all that easy. There's plenty of folks that are challenging that.
Sure.
So, but when you ask what are the odds, no one's ever shut down or had an oil pipeline be decommissioned without the industry wanting it. So this is an unprecedented thing that Michigan's even considering,
Right.
this revoking of the easement. It's a tall order, but I think it's really encouraging at least to see that our governor is looking at it very carefully, our new governor, and putting the Great Lakes and Michigan's interests first, as opposed to just assuming Enbridge's interests are in our interest, because I think we've seen that they're not necessarily.
So it probably stands to reason that if there was not a spill in Marshall, Michigan, it probably wouldn't be on your radar or anybody's radar right now.
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
I think that's what really got this whole thing going.
Yeah. They made their own bed, right? So
That's right.
Yeah.
They have. And, you said I'd look forward to talking to you in the future about climate, but I think a big part of the context here is where is the oil industry going? What, should we be expanding that infrastructure, or should we be talking about, the news in Michigan is we should be preparing for electric vehicles. Well, if that's the industry, the auto capital of the world here, why are we taking a risk with our other biggest asset, or our very biggest asset, the Great Lakes,
Sure.
for oil, when that's not the future?
Yeah.
I think those are kind of just the obvious questions that we need our leaders to be addressing.
All right, Jim.
Well,
I
thanks.
appreciate
Thanks,
you
Russell.
coming on. It's been a pleasure to learn about what you have going on with Groundworks, and your position on Line 5.
All right, you're welcome.
All right.
Thanks.